the audience. Is that okay? Nice. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Today we are joined by David Rosenthal. I'm sure you all know him very well. He's going to talk to you a little bit about his science and art exhibit that he has currently on display in Anchorage at the Anchorage Museum. Is that correct? Yeah. And you guys can see that from now until June?
September 14th.
September, okay, of next year. So go check that out the next time you're in Anchorage on a Costco run.
You don't have any excuse. I don't want to hear anybody say they didn't see it.
Missed it.
Yeah, I'll let David take it over.
Okay. All right, well, thanks everybody for coming. It's a small group, but I'm used to that. So, and because it's a small group, feel free to ask questions. No, you don't have to worry. It's not too formal. So.
The cursor is popping back on the screen. Okay.
So anyways, I think I know just about everybody here. And so I don't have to explain too much about myself. And that's good because this is a little different than my other talks about my artwork and so on. And about myself, because I want this to be about this exhibition that I've been working on for a number of years, and is at the Anchorage Museum. But I'm an artist. I have to show you some of my stuff, even from far back, to show you how I got here. Because I call it a science and art exhibit, and I'm not a scientist, but I have a science background. I studied physics and flunked out. So I do have a little bit of a science background. So but I do like to make the point, I'm not pretending to be a scientist, but I feel that I've spent so much time around the glaciers that I've started to, or I understand a lot about them. And I realized about 5 years ago that I have a really good show, because I've been watching these glaciers retreat for years. And it just so happens that I ended up in the perfect place to watch glaciers, as well as this place coming to Cordova eventually sent me, in a way, down to Antarctica and to Greenland and all over the world looking at glaciers. So I've got almost 50 years in painting glaciers, observing glaciers, playing around glaciers, working on glaciers, etc. But I'll show you where I started first, and then we'll keep going. This is how I started in Maine, where I would just out of my head, I would remember things and I'd put them together, and one night I'd make a painting like this. And my interest was really not in art, it was in nature. And for some reason, my love of nature, I just felt like painting nature seemed like something I wanted to do. I had no pretensions of being an artist. And this is another one that same way, but here I took some old dead trees I had seen, and I put them next to a pond, and I just created this painting. And this method works real well in Maine, because Maine is kind of fuzzy. You know, there's short sight lines, a lot of brush in the way, and there are some distinctive features, but most of Maine looks kind of similar. And so I could do this, and people would come up and they'd say, "Well, that's my backyard. How did you find that?" You know, and of course, it wasn't their backyard. But so I worked the same when I first came to Cordova. I came up here to work in the cannery, and eventually I started to spend winters here. And this is from my first winter. And this painting I basically did mostly from memory. But it led me to I learned a lot of things about painting doing this, but the most important thing was, it's at this point that I figured out that in Alaska, you need to draw things first, because you can't remember, like Mount Eccles is Mount Eccles. It's like a portrait. I can't remember that. People think I have a photographic memory, but I don't. I need the drawings to show me the structure. And that's where my work started to really improve. This is another painting of that same time period, where I learned how to handle the paint and use glazes, etc. Now, I like to point out, because sometimes I think that maybe there is a plan for us, because I point out that just by chance, I had come from Maine, where I grew up hearing about the Ice Age, the rocks in the fields. Oh, the glaciers dropped those, and the coastline was carved by the glaciers. But the Ice Age was over. And then just by chance, I got a job in a cannery in Cordova. And look where Cordova is. It's in the remnant of one section of the Cordilleran ice sheet. See? And so I end up in the remnants of the Ice Age. And you can see over there, that's where that is, that little, this little nub of that South Central right there. And so when I came up with this idea for this show, I started doing some paintings that were my artist interpretation. This is from a trip up to Baldy to go skiing, of course, on the snowfields on the other side, but overlooking the flats. And that was from, 5-6 years ago. I don't think I've been able to make it up there since, so. But then I painted it the way that I feel that it might have looked someplace in the Ice Age, because basically the continental shelf would have been uncovered, because Ice Age, the water levels were lower by some estimates, 300-400 feet. And so the glaciers, all of the glaciers coming out from, here, would have pushed out to sea something like 40 miles. And so you'd be looking from up on Baldy, you'd be looking out to the Gulf of Alaska, but you'd be looking over glacial, just a flat glacial sheet. Now, I should point out, these are from the State Museum Juneau show. They just rebuilt their museum 5 years ago. It's spectacular. They had this huge space that they gave me. And so in this space, I had a number of ideas for this show to make it more than just an art show. And one was, I made these what I call narrative panels that tells the story of Childs and Miles Glacier, so that instead of just seeing the glaciers, you have an understanding, or people looking at the show will have an understanding of what's occurred here. And so you'll notice that here is, in 2019, that's what Childs Glacier looked like. In 1977, when I first saw it, the calving face was this, about almost a mile long, and it was anywhere from 250 to possibly 300 feet high. It was incredible. Excuse me. And of course, in 2019, you could walk up that same face. And then I realized that I can go back in time to help explain more about this retreat. And so up here, that's what I believe that Childs and Miles Glacier would have looked like, maybe before 1800 or 1700, sometime in the Little Ice Age, where the Copper River would have wound through them, through the two glaciers, and the glaciers would be much more, much more dramatic. And I got this information because there's this book called, now I can't remember the name of the book, but Tar and Martin were the what's the name, David?
Alaska Glacier Studies.
That's the one. Alaska Glacier Studies by Tar and Martin. They came up in, I think it was 1913, and they did surveys of all the glaciers along the coast. And they looked at this area here, and they found that, and this is 1913, they found that there was no vegetation before, or there was no vegetation older than 70 years. And that means that, or Miles Glacier used to come in and cover that. And that's why I covered it with that glacier right there. So, and I like to point out that because I do have something of a science background and I look at the world, I like to think in a more rational way because of it. When I do these reproductions, you'll notice that how little you can see of the mountains in the distance, because the glacier would have been much thicker besides slowing down. And then in 77, it was more could be seen, and then now it's even lower. So these little details, I like to think, make it realistic in people's mind. And so I have the information panels, the narrative panels. I made these sets of paintings to show the retreat as illustrations. And then I have some of my original artwork that were done at different times. This one was from 2010 or so, from under the bridge on the Copper, where the glacier just loomed up, because you're right at the foot of it. So, and then this is Miles Glacier coming in from the other direction. And these information panels, or narrative panels, have information on how they've retreated. You can barely see them in these slides, but the idea was to hold people's attention with these narrative panels so you could, learn more about it. But in this case, you've got Miles Glacier down here as it is in 2019, where it's, Miles Lake is 6 miles that direction up to the glacier or something like that. This is how it was described by Lieutenant Al. He got up on this same moraine. It's that, there's some sort of a communications tower up there now, and you hike up and you get these views, the ones previous as well as these. But he described as there was 125 yards wide of the Copper River, the whole flow going in between the moraine and Miles Glacier. And so just using that information, this is how I think it might have looked, which is pretty dramatic. So, and then Sheridan Glacier, once again, there's an information panel, and you can see how the glacier has changed. In 77, it pretty much filled this. These maps that shouldn't be used for navigation because they're not exactly right. But basically, you can see the lake now is, it varies because the glacier sometimes pushes out fresh stuff before it breaks off. But you can see how the lake has just expanded and the glacier is falling apart. And so in 77, when I first got here, you used to have to walk over a glacier to get to the big lake. Some people might remember that. 2010, the glacier ended here. And now there's no glacier in this. This is looking, of course, east, if anybody would know from here. And then when you look north, this was what it looked like. This was a painting that I actually did, and I still have it, so it's part of the show now. But that's looking up in 2010. See how solid the glacier looks. And then, this was 2019, I think, when it was still breaking back there. pretty dramatic. You can see the same mountain. And that's where, as a painter, I have that advantage that I can paint these things at different times so that they're under the same lighting and everything's the same. So the only change is what I want you to see, which is the retreat in this case. And there's a closer look at these two. Now this is the Juneau show, like I say. The Anchorage show doesn't look like this because they didn't have as big a space. And so to save space, they decided to put my narrative panels basically on QR codes. So you go to a little QR code and you're taken to an audio tour that explains some of the same information. And the same with the other thing that I came up with for the Juneau show were these science panels. And those, the ones that are in black like that with white lettering, I got scientists I know and other people to put together these information panels to give more credibility to the whole subject. And those are all on QR codes too. So they, they did a really great job, but it was a smaller space. It's not, this is more what I will intend to have for when I try to circulate this in the lower 48 to natural history museums, because I think the QR codes were a good experiment, and I think young people probably love it. But I had to be guided through it, and I don't love it. But,
David?
Yeah.
What's in the glass on the left there? Under glass?
Oh, right here?
Yeah.
Yeah, see, this was another thing that they didn't have room for. But, so you won't see it in Anchorage, but hopefully someplace else. Those are like a pile of sketchbooks and watercolor studies, and the sort of thing that I would do on the boat, and a little, there was an information panel on my working methods and so on.
All the artifacts.
Yeah, well, they're like artifacts.
Your ice skates.
Yeah, my ice. Well, but at any rate, this shows you, there's other views of this that we'll go through, but this is the idea, is that it's, my artwork was supposed to attract attention from people who would never go to a science exhibition. And then the narrative panels or the illustrative paintings were to illustrate these changes. And then the science panel to give, more information and more credible. And then my narrative panels, hopefully, and people were reading them. So it was, I think, successful. I've actually had people come up to me, and when I had it at, in Juneau and at the Pratt and Homer earlier, and they would actually ask me questions about what I wrote in these things. And so this is the form that I hope will travel. I should mention this, the name Painting at the End of the Ice Age came to me because of a painting I'll show you from Greenland, where I titled it The End of the Ice Age, because it showed the edge of the ice retreating in Greenland on the ice cap. And it seems like a nice name, so, but that's just a close-up of that big, all right, this is, you can see some panels here. This one I think is from you, David, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this one too. This is from David Janko, we can thank for his contribution to the exhibit, because I got to go to these places, a lot of these, especially Columbia Bay, because of David Janko and his boat, the Auckland. Now, I like to point out this Columbia Glacier is kind of the poster child for global warming, because it, if you look at these maps over here, you can sort of see that in 2011, David called me and and said, come on, we'll go out, you can get into Columbia Bay. It's been so filled with ice for years, you couldn't get in there. So we went there, and actually a couple times, and this is what it looked like, looking towards the, I guess, the east. And then in 2022, 10 years later, that's the same scene, believe it or not. You know, the glacier has retreated. And the same with this here. See how this is the east side of the entrance, and you got this big face that went like in a big horseshoe around. And now, you know, the face is way, way back there. So, boy, shows you my hand isn't as steady as it used to be.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
All thought and a question. We actually showed the kids a time lapse today and what discovered of the Columbia Glacier.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
But my question is, you mentioned that you drew these because you can draw them, or you can paint them from memory. Did you take pictures of them, or did you just draw out most of them, like sketch it out for the most part?
No, and I'm glad you asked that question, because that's one of my big points about what I do, is I work from drawings. And I've got a sketchbook that afterwards, if anybody wants to look at, the sketches, I use the sketches to get the structure of the drawing, of the painting. And so I get these sketches that sometimes they look like scribble, sometimes you can see real care taken with the with the contours and so on. But I stay away from photos because, you know, and I'm not saying, Milo, that
Careful.
I'm not saying paintings are better. That paintings are better than photographs. But I claim that my paintings are more real to the human mind, because the camera, it's more accurate, but it's not how we see the world. And so for the last 50 years, I've had people say, well, why don't you just take a picture? You know? And now if someone makes the mistake of asking me that, they'll get, I could go on for days on the difference, because there is a difference. Our visual system is active, it processes things. And so you end up having things much different than the way the camera records it. And because we look into the shadows, we look into the light, you know, it's not like one point in time and one point in space that when you take a photograph, you get. It's a process where you're looking here and there. And the last thing I'll say about that, because there's a ton of examples, but one good example is, and Milo can refute me on this, if he wants, and no Photoshop allowed though, Milo. But let's say you have a sunset scene, and you want the beautiful colors of the sunset to be saturated. Well, you've got to turn the light down so that those colors are not washed out. But that means that the mountains, let's say in the foreground, become silhouettes, because with that, you have to, with the camera, if you don't use Photoshop, everything has to, like if you're making the sky darker, then everything's darker. And on the other hand, if you want to see the information in the silhouette, you've got to lighten everything up. The sky gets washed out. And so, but I'm not limited that way, because I look into the shadows, I paint what I saw in the shadows, then I look into the sky, I paint what I see in the sky. So the colors are all bright in the sky. You can see the detail in the shadow, and so on. So it's a different, I've learned, and like I say, I won't say any more because I could go on forever. But there's a big difference between the way we see the world and what we see in photographic images.
It's essentially painting shot.
What's that?
It's essentially painting shot instead of Photoshop.
Yeah, that's right. But it's allowed in painting. I know how photographers don't like. Isn't there a controversy about that? All right. So this is to show you see, there's what we just looked at. And I hung this, or I had them hang it so that it formed like Columbia Bay, you know. It starts over here on the west entrance or side of the entrance, and then it goes to, looking sort of northwest, I believe, then north and, west or east, and then, or northeast and then east. And so I then hung the ones that came from the later date, 2022. I made small versions of them and put them on top of the ones that they compared to. And I should have a really good version of that. Here it is. This is the one that gets the biggest wow when I'm there to explain it. Here's what it looked like in that winter of must have been 2012. It must have been January 2012 that we were out there. And so notice that, the whole bay was, a big horseshoe of ice. And notice this mountain here, and then these ridges. And then look up here. Those ridges are here and here. That mountain's way up here. And so basically the ice is retreated, I don't know, 4 or 5 miles, but it's also lost. Look at the thickness. It barely reaches tidewater anymore there. And so, you think about how it's look at that ridge is completely bare when it was, buried that much under the ice. And so that's why Columbia is considered if I read my science magazines. None of this is from a scientist, but at any rate, I read in one of the articles that Columbia was the largest contributor to sea level rise of any glaciers in North America outside of Greenland, because it's a big mass of ice. So, and then these are just some paintings that, like I say, I never intended to come to Cordova and paint ice, but this is what I was rewarded with from years of hanging out on the ice. And this is the painting that I was talking about. This is Greenland, and this is when I was waiting to get flown up to the summit, where I spent about 3.5 months up at 10,600 feet up on one of the high points of the Greenland ice sheet. And we were waiting in Kangerlussuaq to get flown up there. And you could take this road out and you could see where the ice cap was basically ending and shrinking back. And you can even see, look, this was last year's uncovering because it was just gravel. And then, of course, that was the year before. And some places you could see a whole series of these lines, the vegetation be changing each year. But when I painted this, it was not actually this painting. I painted this to be in the show, but the painting originally that I did of this, which is long gone, it was, I just titled it The End of the Ice Age because seemed like it was the Ice Age ending. And that stuck in my head because that was 2004. And it worked out great for this show. Now, these are illustrative paintings that I did of Mendenhall Glacier. And I don't use photographs at all, except for when I have to put together historical type things. I saw Mendenhall first in I'm not sure if it was 1983 or it might have been earlier, but at any rate, I never did a drawing of it. And so I had to go back and look at photos from that time period and reproduce what it might have looked like. And then, of course, this is what it looks like now. And I did this from a photo too, because I didn't fly down to Juneau to just look at this. And then this was the first science panel. And it was the result of, I mean, from a PR perspective, not from a disaster perspective, but that outbreak of glacial water was, you know, it was on everybody's mind. And so I was able to contact some scientists and they put together some information on that. And it worked out perfect with this exhibit. This is Saddlebag Glacier. And the first time I went out to Saddlebag was my first winter in 1981. And when I still remember to this day, this walking around this corner, because there wasn't a trail. You just followed the stream back and forth across it to get back there. But you come around this corner and Saddlebag just filled the canyon. And it came right up and it used to calve into the lake. And, you know, it was pretty dramatic. And then, of course, this was 2019. And there was still some ice showing, but now you go there and it's just gravel. You know, there might be ice underneath someplace, but it's pretty much to see ice. You got to go all the way to the end and look up. And it's actually probably a quarter mile or more from where this used to be grounded to where the ice or where the moraine starts. And once again, the information panel, which is helpful. But
David?
Yeah?
Can you tell the story about when you went out to Saddlebag to go ice skating and you had the ice that was piled up on the beach where you were going to put your skates on and couldn't figure out where that had come from? It was like all that.
Yeah, that's a good thing to point out. So my first trip out there, and the other thing about this is I should add is I went out there with Carol Becker and Nancy Bird and some other people, and we went out there and look at that green color. It was just this spectacular emerald green. That was one of the things that struck me. So I went back to the cannery where I was working, and I told everybody about, you got to see this glacier. There must be some kind of minerals in the water that it's just emerald green. And so by the time I got back out there with my friends, we go and it's blue. And I finally figured it out. In the winter, that canyon, the high point of the sun is still much lower than we realize. It's yellowish light. And hitting the blue ice, it's just beautiful green. By the time I got back out there, the sun was higher at that same time of day, and it was just blue. And we looked at, because I was thinking of going out there to camp along the shore there, and right about here, there was just all this ice piled up, like something had thrown up, a bunch of ice and lake ice and such. And I figured it out finally, because when you went up here, there was huge slabs of ice that had come off and hit that ice and gone right through the ice, and it would have sent a pulse of, pressure under the ice. And then when it hit the weak spot at the end, it would have just exploded out, throwing all this ice on shore, which kind of made me realize maybe I shouldn't camp right there, So then this is ice skating has taken me some beautiful places. This is Bering Glacier and Vetus Lake, and these views are kind of connected. That's Mount Stellar, Mount Tom White and Stellar, and then this is looking like this would be connected with here, looking back towards Cordova. And the face of Bering Glacier is only 20 feet high at the highest. Most of it's real low because, it's very foreshortened, but from here to here is something like 20 miles, and from here to here is 30 miles or so. It's just spread out in this huge, plain of ice, and by the time it reaches the lake, it's very thin,
Quick question about the slide.
Yeah,
The previous one.
previous one.
It's about your process. The sky seems to blend with the shadows. Do you work in sections, layers? Do you tend to put your foundation down and then?
I didn't pay him to ask these questions. It's a very good question.
Honestly,
because-
I don't even know you. So.
Yeah. See, there's proof. I didn't, No, that's a great question because it allows me, because sometimes I forget these things. But basically, yeah, I work, when I actually do the paintings, I go home and I do it in layers. I put an underpainting down, then I put usually a second more detailed layer of underpainting. Then I start making thinner layers of paint till they're just what are called glazes that are transparent. And so these paintings here, these were done as illustrations because the originals of these scenes are long gone. But basically, they're anywhere from 5 to 10 layers of paint, each one more transparent and more detailed. And that's been the key to getting the realism that I want.
I had one more on that. Sorry for pestering you. Could you go to the Mendenhall slide?
The Mendenhall?
The Mendenhall glacier, yeah, this one. So with this, would you work off of the darkest color here, or would you kind of just pick something in between and then go back in, do darker and then do layers?
Well, see, that's a good question because that's exactly the point of these underpaintings. It's like it's basically the method that the old masters used. They would do what they refer to it as different things. They usually use like sepia or red earth tones, and they do the equivalent of black and white. You establish your lights and darks. Then they put transparent colors over that. And that's basically what I do. I establish the lights and darks right from the beginning. Because with oil paints, people think, oh, you just paint over them. But if you paint something that you want it to be bright white or bright color, and you paint it over a dark surface, it gets transparent and it dulls. So you want anything that's going to be bright white or bright color, you want white behind it. And that's what you establish in the underpainting. And usually, and you use middle colors, not to get too detailed on the techniques, but basically, if you take carbon black and you paint it on a white surface, it will be really dark until it dries. And then you give it another month or two, it will fade to a light gray because it gets transparent. And with the white background, it just lightens up. So what I do is I have to build up the darks. So if you saw the underpainting for these, you'd see that the dark mountains on either side were kind of a light gray, but they were heavily opaque with lead white and the colors to make it gray. And then when that would dry, I would put on a darker layer that had less lead white in it, but it was still opaque, and that would go on top. And even if it got more transparent, it was on a dark background, so it'd stay darker. And then the last coat, three coats down the line, you could take pure carbon black, put it on there, and it will stay pure carbon black. It will, because there isn't light coming through it from underneath. So,
That's the physics degree.
what's that?
That's your physics background.
Yeah, well, I tell people, I may not have gone far in physics, to say the least, but it taught me to paint. I'm self-taught, and it's because of that background that I figured these things out. And, so I tell people more than I did take a few art classes where they tried to stop me from painting landscapes because it wasn't what was done in the 70s. But I learned more from physics than from any art class. And part of that is also because my interest wasn't art, it was nature. And so I could care less what, I wanted to figure out how to show things as realistically as possible and communicate the beautiful things that I see as good as possible. This is Worthington Glacier, these were done from photographs, historical photographs. But I had seen Worthington Glacier in 1978 the first time, and that's what it looked like. And then, of course, this is a recent photo. You can see the change. Then this is Portage Glacier, another one that I drove past that for so many years, you know, starting in, I think, 78. Well, 77, I saw it for the first time when I took the train, and back when they, you know, but the what it looks like now is here, of course. You can't even see it. It's up around the corner. But what I remember was this, and I got this from old photos. And I have to admit, I used my artist license because, to be honest, I doubt that in 78 it was that far out, or 77. But this is how I remember it, you know. I always remember it as you could see the face and there's icebergs choking the lake. So, you know, sometimes you got to use your artist license, you know. Now, this is from the Juneau show again. And this shows you I took an icebreaker trip with the U.S. Coast Guard. As part of their art program, and I traveled up to north of Spitsbergen, up into the Arctic Ocean, up to what used to be kind of a ice cap. It's getting less and less an ice cap and just annual sea ice now. But these paintings here, what I did is I went back, and since they're long gone, I did smaller versions and framed them two to a frame to make it easy to hang for this traveling exhibit. And then I had some paintings from that trip like that still around. So, but what's, you know, I don't have like okay, this is now 2023, but I can tell you, if you were to go to this same latitude, which was about, well, as far north as we got was 8241. And so if you were to go to that latitude, or approximately up north of Spitsbergen, it'd just be open water now, even in the, you know, winter, probably for quite a while. I remember hearing a report 4 or 5 years ago that it was 50 degrees in open water at the North Pole, you know, because it just depends on currents and, you know, and wind patterns and so on. And then another part of this show that they didn't have much room for this either, although there's a few of them in it. But on a second icebreaker trip, I got to go ride along while they broke ice for Thule Air Base up in Greenland, up and down the coast. They broke ice for the refueling and resupply ships going to Thule. And they said to me, well, we're going through the Northwest Passage. Do you want to go? And I said, yeah, you know, after, you know, it was a great trip. And it was because the back then the Northwest Passage was disputed in a way, you might say. That the Canadian government maintained that it was not navigable waterways because it was so ice choked. You couldn't just navigate it. That meant they had control of it. The U.S. was not allowed to just say, we want the right of innocent passage in this international waterway. And the U.S. government said, no, you're navigable. We want to send our 400-foot icebreaker up there, and we'll go through the Northwest Passage and prove that it's it's navigable. And they came to an agreement where the Canadian and the U.S. government, the Canadians said, okay, if you ask permission, we'll say yes. And so they, just to prove the point, they go through the Northwest Passage. And the Canadians sent a 250-foot icebreaker, and we had to lead them through because it wasn't big enough to break the ice through the Northwest Passage at that time. And so interestingly, I remember 20 plus or 30 years later, Sharon told me, she was working at the Serendipity store, and she said, some people came in and they said they're taking their sailboat through the Northwest Passage. And I said, well, good luck on that, because, I'm thinking, how are they going to get through? But of course, it turns out there's so much less ice now, the ice is retreated. And so they do it all the time. Sailboats come and go all the time. And interestingly, too, a lot of you, I met this woman who had gone through the Northwest Passage on a sailboat back when I was on this icebreaker, but it took 5 seasons. They would fly up and go a ways, and then they'd have to stop. And the year that they came through into the Greenland, between Greenland and Canada there, and they had pictures of it. And I met this woman in Homer, and she had a book, and she had some pictures in the book. And I looked, and there was this iceberg that I swore I had seen. And I went back to my drawings, and I found that very same iceberg that the boat was behind the boat in the distance. So I did her a little watercolor and gave her a little watercolor, But at any rate, yeah, this is another example of the changing global warming and the ice retreating, but I don't have a before and after picture of it because I haven't been through the Northwest Passage again. But the Northwest Passage it's kind of desert-like and low hills and cliffs and so on. It's, this is the start of the passage. This is the last glacier I saw up on Banks Island, or forget which, I think it's Banks Island. It's right at the beginning of the passage from when you go from Greenland. And then some of these features are like these drumlins that just stick out of the sand. And it's really, I always envisioned it be full of these giant mountains and glaciers, but it's very dry and the glaciers just don't accumulate. And then doing artists in the schools, I used to go to these villages on the Northwest coast, and I used those as kind of like an analog for Thuringia, which was that area of land between Siberia and Alaska that used to be above seawater, and it's a huge area. The map, you can sort of see it there, but I mean, we're talking about something that's almost the size of the United States that was uncovered back then. But it would have looked very much like Northwest Alaska now. And the same with here. It's just that this coastline would have been miles out to sea, and there would have been a lot more land there. And this is one of those things too, that the differences in our northern Alaska, they're not as dramatic. That's why the glaciers are such perfect things for illustrating the retreat of the ice and global warming, because you can see it. And of course, in Northwest Alaska, shrubs are coming back where it used to be they couldn't grow before, and so on. So there's all these changes that aren't quite as dramatic, but that's part of the show too. And then I like to point out other glaciers, high mountain glaciers. This one is, This is, of course, Denali out of Wonder Lake. And so I point out that there's high glaciers up there, which aren't changing much because they're so high up. And that's when I was artist in residence at Denali. And this is when I tried to climb Denali. I didn't make it. I got cerebral edema at 15,800. But you can see these glaciers are high mountain glaciers, and they aren't affected yet by global warming that much. In some cases, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask a question about your style of painting, but sorry, I didn't mean to get into that story.
No, that's fine. You can ask questions. I don't want to go over on time, but which I've almost done. So it's good. We'll ask questions and I'll just go through these.
So I was gonna ask, it seems like the majority of the paintings almost look like they've been painted under moonlight or at night. Is that a conscious choice or?
Well, see, that's where you have to get used to looking at my work because I'm not, I have only a certain range of light to dark that I can use. And so a lot of times you have to exaggerate sometimes the darkness, look how, and you can't really go by these reproductions, but basically I get that a lot, but it's because you're comparing it to overall. Whereas if you were standing right up, in front of it, then you would only be comparing the lights and darks within this painting, and you wouldn't see that same effect as much. It's just that when you isolate a painting and have a bright thing around it, it kind of looks that way. So, and then this is some of the ice margin on that first Coast Guard icebreaker trip that I still have. And then, as I mentioned, it led me down to Antarctica in the decade of the 90s. I spent 5 years on the ice. That was 4 winters and 6 summers. And these are some aerial views of these huge glaciers. I mean, that's where the ice is really big. But once again, it's more, you need my information panels, I feel, for stuff like that because the changes, aren't obvious that I don't have before and after. I mean, there's some places in Antarctica that you can see the before and after changes, but a lot of it doesn't seem affected. And like these are South Pole paintings. And of course, if you went to South Pole 20 years later or 30 years later, it wouldn't look any different, really. I mean, as a matter of fact, it might have accumulated more snow. The same with, I was up on the Greenland ice cap working as a science tech, 2004, and that was 10,600 feet up. Once again, you wouldn't notice differences. However, when I was there in 2004, it had never rained up that high. It hadn't even, things wouldn't even melt at that high in Greenland's ice cap. The melting occurred only up to 6,000 feet at that time. And now it melts all the way down to the edges. I mean, all the way up to the top and down to the edges. So, seasonally anyways.
Is that hanging in Juneau?
What's
that
that?
one from Juneau?
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Juneau again. I mean, they had so much space, and
Yeah.
This is how I want the exhibit to look at it. And Anchorage, they did their best, but they just limited in space. And so don't be surprised when you go and you don't see these huge. You got another question?
Sorry to interrupt. You were talking, I guess on the topic of before and afters, you were talking about the paintings going straight. With the before painting, how do you, I guess, like conceptualize that? Do you look at like ocean, like seafloor, like the way the seafloor is? Do you kind of just have discussions with subject matter experts? Do you kind of just imagine?
Well, it's a combination of experience because I spent a lot of time as artist in the schools out in these, and then I've gone back to a number of these places later. But basically, yeah, I read science magazines and I hear about how the tundra is overgrowing with more and more shrubs and small trees and so on. So it's a combination of what I know, and so when you don't have like a glacier that you can just paint it retreating, there's not much point. I mean, I can't put everything in the show. So showing Northwest Alaska, like those paintings that were there, those right there that's the Brevig mission, looking at the wave, these little waves coming in on Grantley Harbor and the Bering Sea. The showing shrubs growing in that might show the difference, but it's not exactly. It's not going to be that interesting to people. So I do mostly. I just describe things. So, and I like to. This is the. And I'm working on this all the time. It's evolved from. It's gone to 5 places now. It evolved from. It was actually here at the Cordova Museum, and it fit. It was much smaller, and now it's 3 times that size. But it's always evolving. But I like to point out here, this is one thing that you can see my watercolor travel set, and you can see some blocks and sketchbooks. And I like to have this showing my working methods to explain it, because I'm not there to explain it. And then I get a kick out of this, because that's an old black and white photo of me in Antarctica that they actually used on a brochure from the first time I showed at the Anchorage Museum, which was 1992. And I haven't gotten a show there since. And I told them to downplay me as the artist. This is about the science and science using art to illustrate this global warming. That's what I wanted the emphasis on. And that's why in Juneau, that was about the extent of my presence in the show. And the Anchorage Museum, there's an aerial view of the sea ice up north, and this is what I'm doing now. But at any rate, the Anchorage Museum, I told them that to, downplay, this isn't about me, this is about global warming and using my artwork to illustrate it and to attract attention. And so you walk into there, you'll see that same picture, but 10 feet high.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, I was like, oh, okay. I let them do what they wanted, and they did their best, and it's just space wasn't allowing it. But there was a few of those things that obviously I have a different view of what curators have, and I have to adapt to that every time. But I think once I can get some natural history museums, they will go along like Juneau did with downplaying. This isn't an art show. This is about global warming.
You were telling me about your difficulty getting into the Juneau Museum, and was it along those lines that they wanted an art exhibit? That you said it took you a while to.
Well, yeah, every step of the way, I've had to emphasize that this is not an artist solo exhibit. It's not my painting exhibit. It's not a retrospective, And every step of the way, no matter how I would present it to different museums, with the exception of Cordova and Valdez, I would make that point, and they would still at first, they go, no, you got to apply for an artist solo exhibit, and you get 1 month. And so that's how it was until the Juneau show. And plus I had to pay for everything, going back and forth, me going down there to talk, everything is paid, by me. I finance this all by myself. Until Juneau, they first told me you get 1 month, November, and then I started working with them. They had this beautiful space, and I filled it up, and I guess they realized, wait a second, all this effort to put this up, this isn't an artist show. And so they called me and said, can we keep it till April? I said, yeah, please, And then they gave me a $3,000 honorarium, which covered all my expenses, And then the Anchorage Museum was the same way at first. It took me forever to get them to realize this wasn't me asking for an artist show. it was a general interest exhibit, a science and art exhibit. And they, they finally gave me a show. They said, okay, we'll do a show. And so I contacted them and I said, okay, well, can I get a contract for it? And they sent me the contract and I'm looking through it. And number one, they said it's going to be up for a year. Hallelujah. Number two, they're like, we're going to pay for all the shipping. Although they didn't even pay for it, they got Alaska Airlines to do it for free. See, a museum with all their resources can get Alaska Airlines to ship it for free, but I, doing everything myself, would have had to pay for it. But then the best part was I'm reading the contract, it says artist fee, and it says $5,000. I'm like, oh God, I got to pay $5,000 to show this at the museum? And then I look and it says to be paid in 2 installments to the artist, like, so finally they got the idea that this is not an artist solo exhibit. However, the designer of the exhibit, they're used to doing art shows. And so, like I said, they did, I just said, okay, the museum, your audience, you go ahead and design it. I gave them what I thought I'd like to have in it, and they had to edit quite a bit, but they, it's a nice exhibit there, but it's not exactly what I have in mind. And as it goes to other places, it will be. But at any rate, you got any more questions? These are some of my more recent works, but this is my early work from up on Baldy, looking at Sheridan and Tom White in the different distance. And of course now, Sheridan would be cut off here and it would be hundreds of feet lower where it comes out of the mountains. And, it's just by accident that I ended up at one of the best places to see and record this retreat of the ice. Anybody have any more questions? I put this one in here because I like to, this is my best painting. I did it in 1986. It's Crater Lake, looking into the lake, and you can see the refracted light on the bottom. It's not the greatest image of it, but I've tried since 1986 to paint a better painting, and I haven't. So I've been going downhill since 1986, basically.
Just like that.
And these are some Antarctic ones. At any rate, any more questions? I'm just flipping through these. That's the end. And like I said, if anybody wants to look at a sketchbook, you can take a look at this one.
David, I don't know if you saw, but you had that KTO CBS Anchorage interview.
Yeah.
And did you see how they put it online? Did you see how it was listed? So they have a little thumbnail, and then they have a little, in the upper corner, the title, sort of a title, and they had science.
Oh, did they?
Yeah,
Finally.
yeah. I took a quick screenshot of it. I thought you might like to see that.
It's funny because that interview, I think they cleaned it up, but they sent and this was in Juneau, they sent, I think it was an intern over to, you want to look at this sketchbook? Anybody can look at it, but they sent an intern over, I believe anyways, to interview me. And I didn't think much of it until I read the article that came out in paper form. And my speech, I clutter it up with, all these filler words. I'm not very, especially when I'm just talking offhand, I'm just not the clearest speaker. And it never used to be a problem. The writer would always ignore that stuff and just write what I was saying or meant to say. But in this case, apparently this young woman, she recorded it and fed it into the computer. And if you read it on the website, it made me sound like, a friend of Cheech and Chong. You know, you like, I mean, it just was, I was so embarrassed. I just never went back to it. But then I happened to see it recently, and I think somebody figured out at the Alaska media or whatever, cleaned it up.
Now, this was a film interview.
Oh, this was film?
Film, yeah, this was TV interview.
Oh, was it the interview or?
For Anchorage.
Yeah, you were on the news, the Channel 2 News.
Oh, yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
At some point,
Yeah.
the last few weeks.
But on the page, the little thumbnail to click on.
Yeah, that's right. I did see
And
that.
not art. So
Well,
you got
that's
that.
probably
Yeah.
because I was telling everybody,
Yeah, right.
don't refer to this as a artist solo exhibit, science art exhibit. So, but at any rate, thanks for coming. And
I know you might mention to some of these folks that have not visited your studio, you're always wanting people.
yeah, anybody can come visit my studio and see paintings in progress and see whatever. I encourage you to try and watch me paint. You know.
And play ping pong.
Oh, play ping pong, yeah.
I know.
But
Where's the studio? David?
it's on Center Drive, it's at the end of Center Drive.
Where's
So, where, Chase Avenue goes by the hospital.
I don't know names.
You go by the hospital, come off the top of the River Highway and go by the hospital.
Or you can pick them up.
There's a right,
I'm here all the time, yeah.
there's a right turn, only one right turn in Center Drive. It goes back, kind of back the way it came, so I'm behind the hospital, behind that pond, in that neighborhood. But if you're interested in seeing it, yeah, just give me a call, I can give you better direction.
That would be a lot easier. Most of the
But yeah, I tell people, because a lot of times when it's really bad and rainy in the summer, people bring their relatives who are visiting over for something to do. And I think it's great, because I enjoy showing the work. So, I didn't think you were gonna make it, David.
Oh, yeah, I think you must have misunderstood that we were back and gonna be back for a while. This is how it was listed on the internet. Science.
All right, finally.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, thanks.
Well, free up, man. Where's it gonna go next?
Well, see, that's what I gotta work on. And see, this was, as much as this was the easy part, the hard part is finding it. And especially because my contact, and I'm aiming for big ones.
Yeah.
All they see is an artist who wants to show their paintings, no matter how, and so what I've been doing is partnering with the anchor of the Cordova Museum, so that it's like, it's a show at the Cordova Museum. But now I gotta get back into doing it. It's amazing. But I'm hoping I can get one good show down there. Maybe you'll travel.
Yeah, great. That's a fact. So see, you have to find some place to store all that. If you don't have it.
Well, it's actually, that whole show, which in the Juno case was bigger, about 1,000 pounds.